FUR-FECT Mate, a Shapeshifter series. Written by Sweet Pea. His Baby to Bear, Chapter 8. You look extremely nice in that, Raven exclaimed as she sipped her wine cooler and grabbed Libby's hand. She almost fumbled while grabbing for her drink, but she managed to keep it from spilling on Raven's ruby red gown. While looking in the mirror, she took a tentative drink. If she had to express an opinion on anything, she appeared to be in good health. Libby shifted her weight from one side to the other, scrutinizing herself seriously. It's okay, she said noncommittally, her smirk buried behind her hand as Raven's eyes almost flew out of her skull. Okay, you should be informed that this is an original music by Mac Nash. This is not something that everyone has. Let's start with the obvious, you're a babe. It's scorching outside. Like a snobbish mother. Libby chuckled at Raven's glare and drank another glass of water, thinking about herself. Okay, that's alright. As a result, I'm probably getting a little hot. Her hair was tied up in perfect curls that she couldn't seem to tame without the use of a lot of magic. Raven forced her to put on makeup, which brightened her face and glistened on her flawless skin. She imagined it was related to the sense of purpose she felt as a mother. She had the impression that her figure was made for more than just being admired by men. That was also enjoyable at times. I believe we can leave now, Raven declared as she jumped up and grabbed her Chanel flap bag. She was a tall, slender woman. She couldn't have been much different than Libby, tiny yet curvy with the kind of blue eyes that drew men in. Libby, on the other hand, was entirely at ease in the company of her gorgeous pal. And she was willing to bet she'd garner just as much attention as her model-shaped friend that night. Are you sure that it's fine to leave Reed Andrew with Christine? Libby mumbled as she marched out of Raven's huge bedroom. Are you serious? Isn't Reed Christine's favorite? Raven queried as she paused at the front door to put on a pair of black shoes, and Libby decided to follow her. Her feet began to scream before she could even put them on. Libby tightened her teeth, thinking about what she does on a night out. She hadn't stepped out in heels in a long time. Of course, added Christine, I do. He is a cute little man. Christine cooed as she took Reed Andrew to the front door to say her farewell to Libby. Her heart was in agony. She'd only ever left him in the care of others when she needed to rush to a doctor's appointment or a customer demanded a face-to-face meeting. Writing technical documentation near Silicon Valley and moonlighting as a freelance copywriter not only provided her with enough money to live comfortably, but it also allowed her to spend more time at home with her infant. Reed Andrew's plump face glowed with excitement, and his bright blue eyes sparkled like pearls as she leaned in and kissed him on the cheeks. Every day, the evil voice in her head reminded her that he resembled Jerome. The same one that had been deafeningly quiet when she'd thrown herself headfirst into a night of wild passion with the ex-Navy man. As she swallowed that thought, Libby grinned bitterly. Baby, please be a good boy for Aunt Christine. Bye Mama, he muttered, his face lit up with that endearing little smile that could light up a room. Please contact me if anything happens, okay? I'll keep my phone with me at all times. Libby replied, her eyes pleadingly fixed on Christine. Oh my God, we're going out for drinks, not climbing Everest for 6 months. But if I see a guy named Everest, I'm going to have to climb him. Let's get this party going. Raven grumbled as she dragged Libby out the front door. Libby wasn't sure she knew how to have fun anymore, unless it was watching Scandal or finger painting with Reed Andrew, but Raven seemed hell-bent on teaching Libby what she had voluntarily forgotten. Jerome's point of view. Jerome smacking his lips, kicking back the next tequila shot, and felt the burning heat of it flow down his throat. It tasted like a wonderful night mixed with a trace of regret. But he ignored the latter, instead raising his hand and asking for another round. Wait a second, Lieutenant. Some of us have to go to work tomorrow, Tim jokingly pointed out. There's just one unlucky fucker like him at the table, and his opinion doesn't matter, Tom cynically told his brother. Tim, you shouldn't be whoring yourself off like that. Shifting Squad 6, as you know, is a bunch of camouflage failures. Jerome leaned back in his wooden chair, taking in his surroundings. He said, nothing positive ever comes out of the infantry. Not everyone in the firm was an army, and much to Squad 6's chagrin, the firm kept bringing in teams whose sole purpose seemed to be to boost them. He snatched an empty beer bottle cap in mid-flight, flipping it between his fingers a second later as he continued his preoccupied recon. It was the night after another mission that had resulted in little more than a few more bruises and a few $1,000s more in his bank account, and as usual, that meant they'd be sitting down with the team and letting loose. Sean had been the first to go about an hour previously, but Jerome knew he'd met a hot redhead at the pub and that had to explain for his sudden departure. Mitch and Jordan had both done the same thing. Jerome had last seen them hauling away a matching pair of blondes who were most likely having the time of their life in the competent hands of the Werecougar twins. So he, Tim, and Tom were left at the upscale Batangas restaurant, sticking out like sore thumbs amid the yuppies and techies. I found it difficult to ignore them. Each of them took up at least double the area of any other man in the room, and they all exuded a military atmosphere. It takes discipline, strength, and, most importantly, flat abs. While they sipped their drinks, Jerome noticed at least 5 pairs of eyes on each of them. Women who would gladly follow them home or steal a moment in a back alleyway. But he was having none of it. In reality, he hadn't shown any interest in a woman in a long time. That was unusual for him, as he was usually the first guy to call it a night and then continue his evening with a stunning piece of curvy ass. But here he was, completely uninterested in anything but drinking with his buddies. Nonetheless, his gaze darted around the room, as if searching for someone. I need the money, Tim said quietly, his tone indicating he didn't want any questions about it. Jerome shared a look with Tim's brother Tom before shrugging and taking the shot glasses from the waitress tray. She'd shown as soon as Jerome asked for more drinks, as if she'd been waiting for the chance to dazzling them with her presence. Jerome was convinced she'd been staring at their table the entire night. The dog tags had to have been the final straw. I guess it's getting late now. I haven't gone to Batangas in a long time. While this jackass is at work, I figured I'd go check out the old haunts. We served in the Alameda area for a long, so this seems almost like home, Tom remarked, clinking his glass against Jerome and Tim's. Salud. Salud, Jerome replied again, looking like the lone drinker at the table. As soon as their shot glasses landed on the table, Tom and Tim were on their feet. They saluted Jerome leisurely, which he returned with equal zeal. Are you going to stay, Lieutenant? Tim asked, grabbing his leather jacket and slinging it over his shoulders. He was the group's communications person, but he didn't let them off the hook when it came to anything physical. Looking at him, one might think Tim was just an ordinary jerk, but Jerome and the rest of his team did nothing to dispel that notion, which helped them to be perceived as some thick, dumb meatheads. Yeah, I guess I'll do another round or two, I say, adding that I'll be there in a few minutes. See you at the drop on Thursday, he mumbled, his face half-heartedly smiling. Jerome caught the Crawley brothers' eye before nodding and stomping away like gladiators come to life. Jerome sipped his almost stale drink as he watched them go away through the thick crowd. It dulled the pain of the shot, but he knew he needed another. Or maybe 3. He waved to the brunette waitress who was attempting way too hard to attract his attention while keeping one eye on the audience. The first time she bent over and showed him her magnificent ass, he dismissed it as carelessness, but the third time was the human equivalent of humping someone's leg. It would have set his motors churning quicker than anything else a few years ago. It was a turn-on like no other to see a lady want it so desperately and be prepared to work for it. But what about now? Didn't help him at all. She drew in closer, setting a shot glass in front of him and emptying the others. Is there anything else I could offer you, babe? She inquired, her long lashes fluttering. He was ready to snarl at her when he noticed her eyes. They made him hesitate, and it wasn't until she scowled slightly, marring the delicate lines of her painted-on face, that he awoke from his reverie. Her eyes appeared to be those of someone else. Someone he'd tried to drink away since that terrible night in Manila. "No, not right now. Thank you," he muttered, his grin making her smile like a Christmas tree. He was completely aware of his actions. He'd given her reason to be optimistic. He wasn't supposed to do it, but her gaze made him think he wouldn't be going home alone that night. If only I could look into her green depths and think she was someone else. "Call me if you need anything," she muttered, sauntering away with enough hip wiggle to cause the world's axis to shift. Jerome couldn't lie, so he stood there watching her walk away. But it didn't seem to bother him. He grimaced as he wrapped his fingers around a glass and twirled it around on the table's hardwood surface, his gaze riveted on the crowd. Years of training, the kind that was drilled into his very being and became so ingrained in him that he had to think there was never a time when he wasn't like that, kept him noticing the smallest details. For example, the chubby small guy kept brushing his fingers through his hair, hoping to hide his dissatisfaction with his receding hairline. Or how the three girls at the bar were giggling as loudly as they could in an attempt to attract someone to buy them a drink and pay attention to them. Or how the lovely brunette crept through the crowd, looking more than a bit apprehensive as she followed in the footsteps of her pal. She seemed to prefer to be somewhere else, and a flare of heat pierced Jerome's stomach. It hit him before he realized who he was looking at. His jaw flew open, and he nearly fell off his foolish chair, leaning back to grab one more glimpse of the gorgeous curve of her neck and those strands of curls that lay so perfectly on her creamy skin. Libby. Just thinking about that name flipped his life upside down, and his heart plummeted into his boot. His bear screamed, forcing Jerome's throat to growl, which was only drowned out by the bar's deafening ruckus. Jerome snatched the shot from the table and downed it while pulling a wad of cash from his pockets and tossing it on the table with the other hand. Finally, a game and prey worth pursuing. Jerome stood up and marched into the throng writhing in the middle of the bar, dancing to some music that seemed to him like bass on bass. His leg had a hole in it from a lucky bullet wound, and his arms were bruised from wrist to elbow from scaling a stone wall that no man should have been able to scale. He'd gone over it 3 times during a 30-minute assignment in the middle of an unfamiliar wilderness. His step became a little softer as a result of the wine, but it also cleared his mind. Sharp eyes searched for the body he desired, as well as the dazzling grin that could bring him to his knees like no foe ever could. He melted into the whirling wave of bodies, as if he belonged there, and he was no longer noticeable. Yet another facet of his schooling. He could stand out when he wanted to, and disappear into the background when he needed to. He didn't know what he wanted right now, other than to fucking find her. What on earth is she doing here? He clenched his teeth as the search took longer than expected. Jerome shoved someone out of the way, prompting the knucklehead to respond, "Hey, what the fuck, man?" A single glare from him prompted the would-be fighter to fold in half and mutter an annoyed half-curse under his breath. That is just what I was thinking. No one wanted to deal with a bear who screamed murder on his face. He finally noticed her in the back bar, patiently waiting in line for her drink. He vanished into the dim light of a staircase going to the second floor, leaning against a wall and stared at her. That red dress clung to every curve beautifully, and he was growing tired just staring at her standing there, calmly speaking with the attractive blonde she'd brought in with her. Jerome, on the other hand, was uninterested in the blonde. Libby absorbed his mind and body, as well as all of his attention. He'd been picturing her face and body every day since the last time he saw her, and she was even more beautiful than he remembered. She seemed to be gleaming. She wasn't completely satisfied, but she felt at peace with herself. Her hefty form had become even more enticing, wanting to be grasped and kneaded by strong fingers. His fists were clenched, and he shivered slightly from the effort of not sprinting over to her. He was well aware of the fact that he couldn't. He was well aware that he should not have done so. And he was well aware that he was going to do it whatever. After turning her over to the other team, he hadn't cracked for a month. They'd had so much sex that the effort of back-to-back missions seemed trivial in compared to the fucking Olympics they'd put on in the little cabin. He couldn't get enough of her, and she seemed to share his feelings. And it wasn't only her body that tasted like the best honey, her entire being did. Everything she did, from the way she walked to the sound of her voice to her clever little jabs, appeared to be targeted at getting under his skin. The longing drove him nuts. But then it was daybreak, and she was gone, doomed to be forgotten like any other task. He couldn't take her off his mind. There was no such thing back then, no such thing now, and never will be. As a result, he attempted to carry on as if nothing had happened. Concentrate on what was vital, on the task at hand. His first goal is to keep his troops safe and their targets alive. However, he was no longer conscious of it. When the adrenaline coursing through his veins used to seem like precious lifeblood he couldn't get enough of, it now felt like gasoline to get him through the task. His blood was boiling in his chest as he pulled down one sleazy drug dealer or unlucky mafia boss after another, but his heart was missing. Jerome couldn't take his mind off her. So, during a particularly difficult mission in Guatemala, he rushed into his superior's office and demanded to know where she was. Colonel Kirkstone had stared at him as if he'd eaten too many shrooms in the jungle and it had eaten away whatever little sense he had. The rejection was unequivocal, and that was the end of it. The identities of their marks were kept under strict lock and key. Jerome had a feeling the colonel had no idea where she had been taken or whether she was still alive. They were occasionally like the damn mail messengers, transporting an object in relatively excellent shape from one spot to another. And he couldn't handle it this time. Jerome's fury flared. He became irresponsible and destructive. He'd been given time off for beating a man who couldn't even fight into a bizarrely shaped pile of gory ooze in the middle of Siberia. He'd only recently returned to active rotation, and now his carefully cultivated self-control was unraveling and vanishing around him like strands of silk. It had occurred before. Almira. That was the reason he had left the Navy. Surprisingly, when a Navy SEAL slashes through half the opposing group with a switchblade and a lot of wrath, his superiors don't approve. Or, as he'd completed, in bear form. He'd nearly died as a result of his injuries, and he was given an honorable discharge after getting a Purple Heart. It had taken a long time for him to restore his functional capacity. Libby was really gorgeous. Going up to talk to her may cost him his job, his squad, and everything else that kept him sane. However, only if it was discovered. He licked both of his lips together. He was not going to let her go like that again. This isn't the case. His Baby to Bear, Chapter 10. Isn't this wonderful, Zay? Raven exclaimed above the music, revealing her flawless row of beautiful white teeth. She was sipping a Cosmopolitan, while Libby had chosen a glass of Glenlivet as a treat for herself. She could at least enjoy one aspect of the evening, right? To be honest, she was tired. She'd check her phone every 10 minutes, half hoping and half worrying that Christine had left her a text or a call about how Reed Andrew had orchestrated some sort of jailbreak and was now missing. That was something he was prone to doing. Since he could grab onto something, that kid has been able to climb over anything. Which had occurred much sooner than it should have. Of course, Libby understood why. She wasn't a moron. If the 5-month pregnancy wasn't enough, the fact that he had the largest head of hair any nurse had ever seen on a baby and was holding his head up a few days after birth painted a very clear picture for her. One that she had been fairly successful at avoiding. It was terrible enough that she'd fucked a guy the one and only time she'd met him, but the fact that he'd gotten her pregnant with a werebear kid using her birth control was just the icing on the cake. Another check of her phone confirmed that nothing had happened that would allow her to leave early, so she placed it back inside the small Zara purse she'd purchased online. Something hot burnt her neck, and she turned around, sensing that she was being watched once more. But this time it wasn't the cold, foreboding feeling she was used to, but something quite else. Perhaps even a touch familiar? With a sigh, she brushed the thought away. It certainly is. When are we going to leave? Libby inquired, attempting to pose the second question as nonchalantly as possible. Raven closed her eyes and grumbled, laying one of her long arms over Libby's shoulders and conspiringly pushing into her. "We're leaving when you pick a guy and fuck him," she remarked confidently, as if she devised the perfect plan in the world. As Raven revealed her brilliant plan, Libby's jaw dropped open and she felt blood rush to her cheeks. She blushed like a schoolgirl hearing the word, fuck, for the first time in a split second. "Stop joking around, Rav," she remarked, poking Raven on the side. "I'm now a mother. I can't go around doing dumb things like that." "I think the lady protests too much," Raven declared with a flourish, her gaze already searching the potential victims. She flashed a few of winks and smiles, and before Libby knew it, there was a swarm of men surrounding them, and Raven was busy introducing her to all of them. Since she was a sophomore in college, Libby hadn't heard so many cringeworthy pickup lines. She had to confess, though, that it made her giggle, which she desperately needed. Libby felt the heat of the whiskey warm her as she eased herself into conversation with a guy who appeared to have much too many teeth and his shirt was cut a little too low. It softened the sting of being watched by substituting one tempting warmth with another. Dodging a round of, "So what do you do?" like a pro, Libby found herself floating away from Raven and her group, being directed to some chairs by the guy with the horse teeth. He was called Bob, Jake, or something equally incomprehensible. For a little while, she considered that she might, just might, be able to enjoy herself. But the moment she sat down, Jake was immediately next to her, so close that a penny couldn't fall between them. She slid slightly to the right, but he quickly filled the gap, grinning like a famished cat gazing down a songbird. Even the heat of the whiskey couldn't get rid of this nonsense. "Hey, I think I should get back to my friend," Libby remarked, smiling briefly and rising to her feet. Before she could get up from the cushions, his hand was on her wrist, roughly pulling her back. Libby caught herself yelping and dropping some alcohol, but before she could tell the creep what she thought, a whirlwind of raw violence flew past her. Jake was dangling from the wall, his legs uselessly dangling below him, his hands grabbing Jerome's sleeves. "Fucking hell, dude, let me down," he grumbled, attempting to kick Jerome. Jerome snarled as he moved one hand from Jake's shirt to his neck, clamping down as if in a vice. Libby's expression was a mix of terror and excitement. Is it really him? The thought that her eyes were playing tricks on her and that she had had one too many glasses of alcohol seemed equally plausible. Libby regained her composure when Jake's face became white and blue and no one came to take Jerome off the guy, despite the fact that they were hiding in a remote nook. She leapt to her feet and wedged herself between Jerome and Jake, pressing her finger into his chest. "Put him down, Jerome. He's not worth it," she said. "Are you certain you don't want me to pop his head off like a balloon?" "Because I'm quite tempted to do so right now," Jerome hissed, his gaze fixed on Jake, filled with the kind of hatred that should take decades of torture to accumulate against a single individual. It appears that all it took was one false move to unleash the full power of the werebear seal. She may have been flattered if she hadn't been so terrified about Jerome actually killing the guy. Jake let out a gargling sound, which could have been the final half-breath of oxygen seeping from his lungs. "Yo, Rambo, keep your eyes down here," Libby said, waving her hand in front of Jerome's face. He jerked his dazzling blue eyes down, thick with emotion, and she was taken aback yet again by how much they resembled Reed Andrews. He'd be a carbon copy of his father one day, but hopefully without his predilection for thrashing whatever he didn't like. "That's better," Libby murmured quietly, fighting the current that drew her safely into the depths of his eyes. "Put him down. He's just a jerk. He didn't hurt me in any way." Jerome paused for a while, but Jake's hands were suddenly lifeless at his sides. Jerome sighed and indicated for Libby to move out of the way before gently lowering the man to the ground. Jake crumpled to a ball, coughing and wheezing, as soon as Jerome released go of him, his knuckles white with strain. "You fucking psycho," he wheezed, his eyes crimson and bulging from his skull. He'd undoubtedly ruptured a few blood vessels. The way Jerome was rolling and unrolling his fists, The guy was lucky to have gotten away so easily. At your service, Jerome snarled back, his face contorted in rage. It fell through as soon as he looked at Libby. The wrath had faded from his eyes, and his jaw had relaxed. That cocky bad boy she'd fallen for like a crack junkie was back in a second, smirking and entirely at ease. Or, to put it another way, not fully at peace. Libby noticed the strain in his shoulders, the way he kept himself ramrod straight, as if he couldn't trust himself to let go around her. Would you like to tell me what you're doing here? Should I make another dash for the rear door? Libby inquired, injecting as much venom as she could into her tone. That was all swept away by his low chuckle. Jerome looked at her as if the only thing he wanted to do was bend her over the bar and fuck her in front of everyone in the bar. Libby wasn't sure she could have refused him if he had offered that as an option. No, this time, the only person you need to be fleeing from is me, honey, he added, emphasizing his subtle drawl that made her knees buckle beneath her so readily. Yeah? Is that an official recommendation? She inquired, the corners of her mouth raised in a grin. She couldn't help herself. That's what he did to her. It made her feel confident, as if she could ask for anything and obtain it. She looked like she could fly if she jumped off a building. But klaxons were going off in her head at the same moment. He wasn't exactly the type of guy to put your trust in, was he? That smirk vanished from her lips, and a healthy scowl took its place. Just a friendly reminder, he replied, putting his hand on her elbow and leading her farther into the club's back room. He seemed far too serious when he said that. Can you tell me where you're taking me? She inquired, having flashbacks to the last time he'd been cryptic with her. Somewhere we can discuss, he continued, looking straight ahead and guiding her past the onslaught of people surrounding them. Jerome took her to the club's fluorescent-lit back passages, which led to the club's second, mostly abandoned exit. He came to a halt and turned, essentially cornering her. Yes, she had remembered a couple things. She had remembered, for example, the mole that produced a small dot on his right earlobe, or the nearly chiseled straightness of his nose. He was still able to take her breath away, even if she was meant to despise his guts. It was infuriating. What do you want to say to me? Libby inquired, putting her arms across her chest. She felt helpless in front of him. He was probably enjoying it, knowing him though she definitely didn't. But the confident smirk had vanished, and the man who peered back at Libby was no longer the arrogant jerk who had fucked her on every piece of furniture in that tiny cottage. It was the man she'd noticed staring at her as she was escorted into the back of an armored Humvee and driven to an unknown place. A man who was haunted by a loss he had already experienced and was about to experience again. It made all the sass in her throat dry up. His Baby to Bear, Chapter 11. He began to speak, but the words died on his mouth before he could finish them. I missed you. It's far too melodramatic. It was only one night. Yes, it had been a fucking amazing night, but he had no reason to believe she was in half as much trouble as he was. And, once again, he wasn't supposed to be talking to her, but when he saw that guy put his hand on her, he couldn't help himself. It was as though his legs carried him across the club on their own, fully avoiding the difficult route between muscles and brain. And by the time he realized what he was doing, he could feel the man going slack in his hands, battling to maintain his lucidity. Jerome might as well have killed the fucker if she hadn't stopped him. And he wouldn't have changed his mind for the world. How are you doing? He eventually inquired, embarrassed at how trite that sounded. I'm all right, she answered. Good to hear. I'd hate you to miss all the great things Batangas has to offer, he quipped dryly, trying to make some space in his head for anything that wasn't the uncontrollable urge to taste her sweet pussy. He was rock hard in his jeans and he could only thank the shitty lighting for the fact that she wasn't intimately aware of that yet. You bet. Here for the scenery and the good wine. Not because some faceless corporation planted me here and told me to be Zaira Mogtongol. The hell kind of a name is Mogtongol, anyway? Jerome laughed, relieved that he still possessed the capability to do that. Not all was lost yet, it seemed. That's what I said, Libby said, smirking. It was right there. That grin. Back in that small cabin in Manila, she'd made that grimace at him when he dived for her. The one thing that would truly drive him insane. He mentally bid farewell to his feeling of honor and duty, opting instead for the woman. At the very least, for the time being. Jerome drew Libby closer to him by slipping his hand around her waist. As her soft body gave against his and her hands rested on his chest, exactly where they were supposed to be, he let out a groan of approval. He offered her a chance to back up, complain, and scream her lungs out at him. She would have done all three if he had given her a second longer, but she didn't. His tongue immediately invaded her mouth as he kissed her hard. His mind was whirled by her flavor. He bit her lower lip with his hips pressed into hers, growling as he did so. She said, and thanked the spirits above. Her tongue lapping against his, her hands fisting around the fabric of his shirt and tugging him lower so she could kiss him harder, deeper. She kissed him back with a cry. Of course, he complied. How could he not, when his entire soul had been devoured by thoughts of this unattainable, lovely woman, and now fate had bestowed upon him the opportunity to taste her once more? Even if it was only for a few minutes, he knew it would be taken away from him. Heat danced off their bodies as he claimed her mouth, licking, biting, kissing. They were standing right next to a fire exit that led out of the club, and without a second thought, he unlatched it and slammed it shut, effectively cutting anyone off from exiting from the bar. No one had come in from the other direction, so Jerome could hope that they had the good decency not to for a while longer. Not that he cared at this point. Fuck, you're hot, he hissed, moving from her lips to her neck and then down to her deep cleavage, gorgeously inviting in that low-cut dress of hers. Jerome moved his palm up the silk length of her stockings without hesitation, liking the way the lace stopped at mid-thigh and he could feel her clear, smooth flesh beneath his touch from there. He remembered every curve, every valley and dip. Her hands coiled in his short hair and he felt her nails scrape across his scalp, whimpers on her lips. One hand cupping her sex, he could have drowned in the fire emanating from her. He couldn't help himself. Instead of controlling his need, he pushed it forward, gave it free rein over him. He pumped in with his fingers again and again, leaving her no respite, no time to ponder, no chance to rationalize. He wanted her to explode around his fingers, twisting in passion and screaming her head off, just like she had in that cabin. Jerome, we shouldn't, she exclaimed, writhing pitifully away from his touch but only succeeding in making him stroke into her quicker. He hissed, his lips inches from hers, if you tell me to stop, I'll stop. Honey, do whatever you want. If you ask, I'll fuck you right here. I don't give a damn if somebody sees us. A breathy moan followed, almost causing his cock to explode out of his jeans. He wanted nothing more than to immediately fill her with his length, but he was ready to wait. At the very least, this time. As she writhed and bucked against him, her juices coated his palm. All hesitation vanished and was replaced with a nice, hard finger fucking. Libby clutched to his shoulder, her cheeks flushed with a seductive glow. Her eyes were half closed, and he released go when he sensed her contracting around his fingers. Every thrust almost entirely extended his fingers before sinking back in, causing her to stretch around them. When she crested, he scissored his fingers inside of her, hissing against her ear, and he didn't want to stop. Her skin reflected the blue light, giving her a ghostly aspect. Jerome couldn't tell if he was hallucinating the whole thing. Libby screamed into his shoulder and shook like she was in the middle of an earthquake. His fingers were merely there to keep her filled, his thumb still gently caressing her clit, as he steadily slowed down his rhythm. Every slight provocation elicited a new spasm from her. Libby gasped for a breath, finally lifting herself off Jerome's shoulder, and Jerome chuckled. Her hazel eyes were lustful, and her lips were scarlet from kisses and lipstick, slightly parted now in her post-orgasmic pleasure. Before raising his palm to his lips, Jerome moved away from her and delicately arranged her underwear over her mound. Libby stood there, surprised and aroused, as he licked her secretions off his fingers. She appeared to be undecided about whether she should be upset with him or simply kneel and return the favor. Jerome was fine with either option. As long as it meant spending more time with her, I was fine with it. You bastard, she growled, but she didn't mean it as a punch. Heavy fists banged on the escape, muffled voices screaming something about it having to be unlocked, while Libby fell against the wall. Jerome was unconcerned. All he cared about was that Libby was with him, and that she'd been brought back to him by some strange twist of fate. With a grin, he said, "At your service. How about we get out of here before something really horrible happens? How about we get out of here before something really bad happens?" Like what, exactly? In the name of my honor, you'll try to choke someone to death once more. Sure, if that's what gets you going. Jerome winked, and Libby, despite her best efforts, burst out laughing halfway through her stare. After 18 months, Jerome felt like he could breathe again, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He took her hand in his and dragged her forward, pulling her out of the corner that he would remember fondly. "But," Libby said, "my friend." While her lips were expressing one thing, she kept up with Jerome as he took her out of the club's back exit and into the warm but fresh Batanga's air. "She's a big girl, she'll take care of herself." The light from the nearby pubs made it slightly darker than noon, and Jerome's eyes rapidly adjusted. He chose a path at random and began going in that direction. Libby followed behind him with some trepidation. "And where do you think we're heading now?" she inquired after they had been walking for a while. "Home. Are you a local?" "No, your house," says Jerome as she processed that particular piece of information. Jerome could feel her stiffening and her step stuttering. He couldn't stop himself from smirking a little. "Do you have any idea where I live?" "No, but I have a feeling you'll show me." His pulse was hammering beneath all that bravado, like a speeding train barreling down the tracks, ready to derail and detonate at any minute. He had no idea what he was going to accomplish or how he would go about doing it. They'd only spent one night together, and she might as well have been unconcerned about it. However, the way she kissed him back and melted over his fingers led him to believe it wasn't totally true. So tomorrow is fucked. He was going to bask in the idea that something had reunited him with the woman he'd been fantasizing about. He was so ecstatic about it that he didn't even notice the chilly shiver that ran down his spine as a set of evil eyes followed him and Libby down the street. Trouble seemed to follow him everywhere he went. "Girl, go grab yours. Christine is taking care of the baby tonight." Read the message, which included a dozen happy and winky faces. Libby sighed as she tucked her phone back into her purse and searched for her keys. Despite knowing better, she'd came home with Jerome to her small townhouse, which was sandwiched between much larger and more opulent homes. She listened as the key slid into place and the tumblers on the locks gradually undid themselves, and a familiar feeling overcame her for a brief moment. The fact that Jerome opted to place his hand around her waist and lean down, gently kissing her earlobe, didn't help matters. She was shocked and jumped a little. It simply made him giggle darkly, filling her ears with his rich baritone, which she admired. Libby laughed and said, "Knock it off." She entered the house and tossed her purse on the chair close to the front entrance. She then stepped out of the shoes and exhaled a sigh of relief. She walked deeper inside the house without looking back, fully knowing that Jerome's eyes were probably glued to her ass with every step she took. And she absolutely adored it. "Would you like a drink?" she said into the corridor as she poured herself a glass of whiskey in the kitchen. When Jerome appeared in the doorway, he added, "Whiskey, if you have it." He'd forgotten his combat boots in the hall and was resting against the doorframe, hands stuffed into the pockets of his well-worn pants. His black t-shirt was snug around his big chest and nicely wrapped around his biceps. Despite her best efforts to look away from him, she couldn't help but notice the way his dog tags bulged against the front of his shirt and the cloth flattened over his abs. Why couldn't he have gained 20 pounds and shaved his head or something? Exasperated that she was falling into the same trap with that beast of a man as she had the last time, she thought. She slid the drink over the counter at him and leaned against the counter herself, her back to Jerome and her gaze fixed on her backyard. Reed Andrews' red ball remained, but she didn't think Jerome would notice. "Thank you honey," he said. "I think you should stop calling me that." "It's Syra now," Libby murmured, casting a sidelong glance at him. "Libby is my favorite." She chuckled, "Me too." His bright blue eyes were fixed on her, and whenever she met his look, she felt like a fly caught in a honey trap. It was impossible to get out of it with any degree of skill. She bit her lower lip, putting the glass to her lips and taking a quick sip, trying to divert her attention away from all the other things she might have done with the time they were given instead of forcing small talk. She hurriedly searched about the kitchen, making sure there was no evidence of the baby's presence. She didn't want to have that conversation with him. She was not going to pull him into this, no matter what occurred. The fact that they'd met at a filthy pub in Batangas of all places was a sad twist of fate, but she was determined not to see it as some kind of divine omen. Libby felt he had a right to know his child, but she also knew it would only make things worse. For God's sake, she had no idea what his last name was, let alone anything else about him except that he slaughtered people for a career and had the most exquisite quads she had ever seen on a guy. That wasn't quite enough to start a new life on. No, it would have been much better for everyone if she simply forgot about him. She knew it was silly of her to kiss him at the darn bar, but she couldn't help herself. He had a way with her that she couldn't deny, and she listened to everything he said. She reacted whenever he kissed her. And, despite the fact that she knew she shouldn't have done it, she really desired that one night with him. Another memory to add to her vault, one that will keep her going through a lifetime of less interesting guys. Or, if they weren't good enough to be around Reed Andrew, no males at all. Is he, however, good enough to be around him? A nefarious voice inquired, spitting uncertainty in its wake. The way he gazed at her made her believe that maybe. Is everything all right, Libby? He inquired, placing his glass down and approaching her. He encircled her in his arms, stood directly in front of her and hovering so close to her that their bodies were practically touching. She was desperate to reach out. Instead, she took another sip of her drink and gazed up at him, attempting to avoid the love-lost puppy expression she was sure she was wearing that night. She smirked and answered, "Well, no." "Yeah? What's to stop you?" He was playing along with her, as seen by his sardonic grin. Maybe he was as perplexed as she was about everything, but for that one night, it didn't matter. He'd be sent on another mission, forgetting about that female he fucked twice, and she'd be able to flush him out of her system like a terrible virus. To her, that sounded about right. "You haven't kissed me yet," she whispered as she pushed the glass away from her face. "That's an oversight I can easily correct," Jerome replied as he dipped down to her level, tilting her chin forward. There was no power in the kiss this time, simply love. Slowly and carefully, he traced the beautiful curvature of her lips with his tongue before sliding between them and continued the languid, gentle strokes. Libby purred, running her flat palms over his chest and stomach before reaching behind him and grasping his ass with far more vigor than she had anticipated. Jerome snatched her hands and yanked them away from her. Honey," he said. "You're not going to rush me." He gave her that sardonic look that could only bode danger. "I have plans with you, and I won't allow you meddle with them," he said. "Plans? What are your plans?" she inquired, but her interrogation was stopped short when Jerome tossed her over his shoulder and walked out of the kitchen as if he'd found a pot of gold. She truly wanted to be enraged with him. But for some reason, she couldn't stop giggling. "Where do you think you're going to take me?" she questioned, kicking her legs and laughing hysterically. "Obviously to the bedroom," he murmured as he strutted down the corridor, trying one door after the next. When Libby realized where he was going, his palm had already closed around the knob leading to Reed Andrews' room. "No, that's not the one. At the very end, the last one," she yelled, and luckily, he let grip of the knob and walked toward the door she'd called out. From the entryway, he slammed the door shut and flung her down on her back on the bed. He was on her before she could take a breath, slowly kissing a trail down her neck and cleavage, trapping her beneath him. "So, this is where Miss Olivia, Libby, Guerrero sleeps?" He paused for a moment before continuing. "You knew my surname?" Libby inquired, perplexed. "I did my digging," he remarked nonchalantly as he collapsed next to her on her comfortable but old blankets. "And what did you find?" says the narrator. "Are there any skeletons I should be aware of? Maybe I stole a lollipop in kindergarten and that's why a gang of black men came to kill me." "Nah," Jerome chuckled. "I don't know nothing about that. Though, now that I think about it, You do seem like a troublemaker. Oh yeah? She said, why is that? Well, I saw your Facebook account, he said. Wasn't it true that you were a bit of a loose cannon in college? Jerome dodged the pillow she'd flung at him and caught it in mid-flight, easily hurling it back at her. Honey, I'm shooting the messenger. That is not how you should treat your guests. And I'm sure you know everything there is to know about how I should treat my visitors, Jerome remarked. I could make an educated guess. Okay, so you're familiar with my name. And you've seen my social media, which effectively means you know everything there is to know, she said, raising her hand to silence him. I believe that is unjust. Jerome, I don't know anything about you. Tell me, what do you want to know? He inquired, sitting on her bed and sprawled out as if he intended to stay there till his patience ran out. Is Jerome even your real name? She said, launching into the first of a lengthy list of questions she'd been wanting to ask about her baby's father. It was right up there with any family history of mental illness. What's the rate of cancer in your bloodline? Can I expect my son to start turning into a bear cub at random times? The irony of it all was overwhelming. Sitting in her bedroom with her child's father, trying to figure out if his name was indeed his name and wondering how long it would take him to admit he was a werebear. It's Jerome Nicholas, he said. Nicholas? Irish? Mexican? Spanish? It's truly Spanish. You won't be able to find me on Facebook either. Ah, an Instagram sort of man, huh? Libby taunted, receiving a look from him that may have been both amusement and a burning desire to fuck her crazy. For some reason, she was convinced he was a competent multitasker. He was capable of doing both. Did you know I was going to be there? She inquired, unsure if she wanted to know. She had no choice but to find out. If there was any risk, it would not just affect her, but also read Jerome. And she doubted she'd have an army of buff shifter commandos at her disposal whenever something strange happened. Jerome shook his head, and the bad boy cockiness vanished, replaced by what she could only interpret as genuine confusion. No, I didn't, I replied. When I saw you, I was there for no particular purpose. I wasn't going to let that fucker hurt you, he said, balling his fist around the sheets. Libby frowned and placed her hand on his. Temperance. She'd be lying if she said it wasn't a turn-on, knowing how quickly and powerfully he was impacted by anything that happened to her. It made her wonder whether things might have turned out differently if she hadn't been transferred to another team, if he'd stayed by her side the entire time. Perhaps he'd be living in Batangas with her, raising their young child together, adoring each other. A lump formed in Libby's throat, which she struggled to swallow. It's a tiny world, he shrugged. I suppose fate wants me to find you tonight. Libby laughed, but he remained solemn, his enticing lips pressed together tightly. Libby remained silent, staring at him in awe. Did he really mean it? That man was really toying with her head. He cleared his throat and rolled back, his hands under his chin, to stare at the ceiling. His shirt pulled up just enough to reveal a portion of the tight, tucked V she remembered all too well. It was difficult to concentrate while he was nearby. Is there anything else? What made you look me up? I was curious about who you were, he answered simply. At the pit of her stomach, butterflies competed for dominance. There are so many questions and so little time. The buzzing of the doorbell startled Libby awake in the morning. She rolled over from one side to the other at first, smacking her nose into Jerome's chest. He was apparently clutching her with both arms, as if he was afraid she would sneak out on him in the middle of the night if he let go. She allowed herself to enjoy his deep, musky aroma for a little period. He'd apparently removed his shirt, and he looked like a marble sculpture come to life on her bed. She was staring at him for a second too long when the obnoxious doorbell rang again. It pierced the folds of slumber that clouded her mind and dawned on her with the startling and uncomfortable realization that no one had ever rung her doorbell. She scooted out of bed, grabbed her dressing gown, and threw it over her shoulders, thinking it would cover the fact that she was still wearing last night's dress. She virtually ran down the passage, praying that whatever was at the door wouldn't startle Jerome. At the same moment, a small voice counted the number of persons who could be on the other side of the door, and the count concluded at 2. She pushed open the door, and there stood Christine, read Andrew on her hip, extending his small hands out for her. "Shit. Mama," he shouted, and she instinctively snatched him from Christine's grasp. "Good morning, sleepyhead. I brought bagels as well as a baby. Christine mentioned that you might have had some fun last night, so I decided to run over rather than have you do it. Sorry if I woke you up, but I have a hair appointment in half an hour and I need to get there." "And Reed Andrew, didn't you miss his mother?" she cooed, taking one of Reed Andrew's hands as he was busy picking from Christine's jewelry. "Thank you, Christine," she said flatly. Libby barely caught every second word that Christine rattled off. Her mind worked frantically to figure out how she could possibly get Andrew out of the house before he saw Reed Andrew or heard Christine talking. Right then, Christine stopped her babbling and looked up, her big green eyes going wide as saucers and her mouth falling open a bit, staring at something behind Libby. "What is it, Christine?" Libby asked, but the familiar feeling of heat on the back of her neck hit her with full force. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Who's this little guy?" Jerome asked, Reed Andrew letting go of her earring immediately and staring up at the tall hulk of a man with surprise. Of course he was standing right behind her. Of course. Shit. His Baby to Bear, Chapter 14. Jerome yawned heavily, rolling off his back and kicking his feet over the side of the bed. His bare toes touched the cool wooden floor and he sprung up, rolling his shoulders back and trying to get blood circulating again. They'd been asleep for maybe an hour, if that. He was still mostly clothed and he wasn't even sure if he felt bad about it. What he'd figured would be a night of guiltless fucking had turned into hours and hours of conversation that neither one of them wanted to put a stop to. She was probably the first woman who'd ever done that to him, made him want to talk to her as badly as he wanted to fuck her. He stretched as he patted out the bedroom door, hearing a happy, sing-songy voice chattering on about something at the front door. Jerome was making a beeline for the bathroom when something caught his nose, making him stop dead in his tracks. He whiffed it in, letting it ruminate for a second. A deep frown cut his forehead and he spun on his heel, heading down the corridor. "Is that a?" "Yup." In her arms while Libby was busy trying to make a blonde leave who looked an awful lot like the friend she'd been out with the night before was a baby boy with the most familiar blue eyes. The same eyes that looked at him every morning in the mirror. Clear, blue, pale and full of something more than simple human curiosity. The eyes of a werebear. The eyes of a Nicholas werebear. He thought he'd stay standing in place, stunned, but his feet carried him forward. Before he knew it, he was smiling at the little boy and he was smiling back, reaching out his chubby hands for him. Jerome plucked him out of Libby's hands easily, and without paying any heed to the blonde, took the boy and moved toward a side room that turned out to be the living room. He caught sight of Libby staring at him blankly, a twist of worry making her lips curl in unease. "Hey there, little man," Jerome said, grinning like a fool. The moment he touched the baby, his heart swelled to twice its size, or so it felt like. A tingle ran through him and then retreated back, as if it was a wave that started and ended with the child in his arms. He had the same facial features as Jerome did, there was no doubt of that. Same high cheekbones, same straight nose and same determined chin, even if it was hidden under the plushy cheeks of a healthy, happy baby boy at the moment. And he was strong. Reed Andrew grabbed Jerome's finger and there was real grip there, far more than a human baby would have. Not only that, but Jerome could smell it on him. The whiff of primal energy, a hint of the animal still dormant within him. Without managing to take his eyes off the boy, Jerome sunk into a wide-backed chair, settling Reed Andrew on his knees. "Thank you again, Christine. Let me know if I can do anything for you," he heard Libby say. "Jesus, Libby, he's hot. I mean, GQ hot. Like, hubba hubba Mr. Lifeguard hot," Christine squealed, not bothering to hide her excitement. Jerome was pretty sure he heard Christine hugging Libby, which he bet she didn't appreciate one bit. "He sure is. Bye now," Libby said, pushing the door closed and waving to Christine. A second later, she practically ran into the room, her face pale as hell. She looked from Jerome to read Andrew and then back again, and he could see how worried she was. How frantic, even. "I think we need to play 20 questions again, Libby," he said calmly, tickling the baby and making him giggle and wriggle in his hands. He couldn't take his eyes off of him. While Reed Andrew had his eyes, he'd definitely gotten his mother's hair and a slightly darker complexion. The fullness of his lips was also certainly from Libby's side. As far as Jerome was concerned, the boy had gotten the best possible mix, looking like the perfect outcome of both himself and Libby. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said, sinking onto the couch across from him. "This way or at all?" he asked, not able to really keep the sharpness out of his tone completely. She recoiled at that, and he immediately kicked himself for it. Libby stood up, her lips pressed in a tight, thin line, with anguish burning in her hazel eyes. The pit of his stomach iced over. Shit, that wasn't how he wanted to start things off. "I think you need to go now," she said, coldly. "Hey, I'm sorry, okay. You can understand I'm a little bit on edge right now, right? Sit down, Libby, let's talk about this." She seemed to think about that for a moment but reluctantly agreed, sitting back down and resting her elbows on her knees. They dug into the soft, checkered fabric, and he immediately wished she was in his lap too right now. The distance of a few feet between them felt like they were on the opposite sides of a chocolate hill, yelling things across that the other one would never understand. "What's his name?" he asked, studying the lines of his face and the slightly protruding, proud arch of his Cupid's bow. Jerome wanted to learn everything he could about the boy. Something inside of him told him that he didn't have a second to lose. If losing Libby had taught him anything, then it was that he always had to go for what he wanted. Even if it ripped his heart out every single time. "Reed Andrew," Libby said, and Reed Andrew immediately echoed it, rolling the R and smiling bright. "That's right, little man. That's you," Jerome said, his voice immensely soft every time he talked to him. "I can safely assume he's mine, yeah? One of my other brothers hasn't stalked you down and asked you to marry him between Manila and now, right?" he asked, chuckling slightly. He had no doubt Reed Andrew was his. And even if he would have, then the bear knew exactly. This was his flesh and blood sitting in his lap. His firstborn son. The crowning moment of any alpha shifter's life, and he'd missed it. Guilt pooled in his stomach, and once again he had to wonder how the hell his instincts had been so right and he'd ignored them so completely. He had known that he needed to find Libby. That she would need him. That he would have to be at her side. And he had failed. It tore a chunk out of him like no grenade or landmine ever could. "He's yours," Libby admitted, a tremor in her voice. Jerome looked up, seeing tears sparkling in her eyes. She was shaking a little, and when she noticed him looking at her, she quickly wiped those tears away with the back of her hand. That broke whatever last piece of his heart that had been intact before, crumbling it right into dust. "I should have been here," he said, guilt dripping off of every syllable. Reed Andrew put his hands around Jerome's neck quickly and gave him that happy, little kid hug that is supposed to fix everything. Jerome couldn't help but grin. Then, Reed Andrew sat down on his wide lap and easily slid off, practically clinging from his knee as he scooted to the ground and then waddled off quickly in search of a toy. The kid had some strength on him. Though that wasn't any surprise, of course, he caught himself thinking with pride. It was his kid after all. "You didn't know. You couldn't have known," Libby objected, though her voice was weak. Jerome heaved himself up and sat down next to Libby, gathering her in his arms and pulling her close. For the first time, she resisted him, staying rigid against his warm touch. His ears hummed, his mind working frantically looking for a way to fix this. But how could he fix a relationship that had never really begun? Who was he to her, anyway? Some guy who'd used her when she was vulnerable. Some guy who pushed her up against the wall at a seedy bar and finger-fucked her. Some guy who didn't know a damn thing about her. And yet, he wanted to do anything in his power to make her feel good again. To make Reed Andrew have the future he deserved with a father, not some shapeless memory from the past who had shown up once, never to be seen again. His insides were in knots and his mind was storming a mile a second, trying to keep up with all the threads running through his head. "I should have," he said, rubbing her arm, though she remained just as impassive, her sad eyes keeping track of the baby. It was a fling, a moment of weakness. I needed someone to distract me and you were there. It was one night that didn't mean anything, she said, obviously struggling to keep the emotion out of her voice. Jerome scoffed, shaking his head. He couldn't buy her claiming that it hadn't meant a thing to her. No way. Maybe without Reed Andrew it would have been a hot night to remember and only that, but it certainly wasn't nothing. He wouldn't believe that. It was one night, I agree. But it meant something to me, he started, looking at Libby and catching the way her lower lip trembled when he spoke those words. You meant something to me, Libby. I told you I looked for you, and I wasn't lying. I tried to find you, but we keep survivors under lock and key. No one can know where you are or who you are now, and that included me. But don't for a second believe that I didn't care, or that I forgot about you. You weren't just some hot night. He pressed every word, trying to make her understand, to make her see that he was being truthful. But the sadness remained steadfast in her eyes and she felt distant, like she was a lot farther from him now than when he hadn't even known where she was. I want to be part of his life, Libby, he said after a long pause, while both of them watched Reed Andrew stack some blocks in the middle of the carpet. His tongue was sticking out and his brow was furrowed in concentration, like he was in the middle of the greatest architectural feat known to man. He looked up triumphantly as he set the last block, grinning at both Libby and Jerome expectantly. Well done, baby. Can you build something else? Libby asked, her voice cracking and falling. She was fighting against what her mind told her and what her heart wanted, he was sure of that. For the life of him, he didn't know how to make her understand that he wasn't pretending. That all she thought he didn't want, he really needed. That he needed her. And Reed Andrew. The thought of going a single day without them now that he knew what he'd been missing could have driven him to the brink of madness. Honey, look at me, he said, gently turning her chin to face him. I want to be a part of his life. You can't deny me that. As soon as he'd said it, he knew he'd said the wrong damn thing. Her eyes went wide and that mama bear that lived in the heart of every mother came tearing out, instinctively lashing out at anything and anyone that dared threaten her baby. In this case, it was Jerome implying that he had any control over what she did with her baby boy. I can't deny you that. Fuck you, Jerome. We spent one goddamn night together, she hissed, keeping her voice low, her cheeks burning with anger. You killed at least 2 people that night, maybe more. How am I supposed to know you weren't the one who fucking stabbed Jonah, huh? You grab me from my home and take me to a fucking cabin in the middle of the fucking woods. And then you won't even tell me what's going to happen next, but you have no qualms about screwing my brains out, huh? She ripped herself away from him, standing up. Reed Andrew paid them no attention, babbling a little song to himself and rearranging his blocks. Small mercies. I sat in a tiny little cell for a month. For a month, a new person came in every day and tried to get me to confess to something I knew nothing about. They asked me how I knew Jonah 1,000,000 times. And 1,000,001 times I told them the same thing. That I was his assistant. That he was a sweet guy. That he called me in the dead of night, begging me to help him. And that I didn't know a single thing other than the fact that this caring, nice man died in my arms, gagging on his own blood and telling me that I had to be safe. She looked like she wanted to pace back and forth, but she didn't. Instead, she shook with rage, almost vibrating on the spot. Any other time, her bout of anger could have been cute for Jerome, especially while she was dressed in a big, fluffy robe, but right now he was in no joking mood. He clamped his hands together in front of him and resigned himself to listen. To concentrate on his breathing and not say another thing before she was done. She needed to let it out and he needed to know. I fucking hope I can fix this, he thought bitterly. He wasn't sure he could. But one look at the blue-eyed boy playing on the carpet told him that he would do anything to make things right. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit notification bell to get updates.